Hello, this is Yarrow Stark from the Entrepreneur's Journey podcast, and welcome to another special interview. My guest on the call today is Thomas Smale, who actually said hello to me via email. And you may recall, if you've been following my podcast from back in, I think it was May of 2012, I interviewed a gentleman named Ian McConnell who sold his model train business for $300,000. It was a popular interview, just a great story of a guy selling his hobby site. And the person he used as a broker to sell his site was Thomas Smale, my guest for today. So thank you, Thomas, for joining me.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on.
So Thomas, as you can no doubt tell, is in the UK, and he is a broker who works for Flipping Enterprises. And what we were talking about before we started the call is some of the numbers we're allowed to say about how much volume you do. So you said last year you did around about $5 million in brokered sales of websites, and you were mentioning some of that was on Flippa, some of that was outside of Flippa.
Yeah, so I mean, the majority of our business now is outside of Flippa. It was around 5 million. I mean, depending on how you look at the deals, because sometimes in the industry you'll do co-broker deals, so you work with other brokers and you split the commissions. So the volume you do yourself is quite hard to determine. Flippa, we did a lot in 2011. We were the top sellers over there with about 1.3 million in sales. But more recently, we've moved over to a little bit more established private buyers. We have less need for the public marketplaces, so it's kind of grown organically.
Right, and that's something I'd really like to talk about. So obviously the subject of this interview is very much on buying and selling websites, in particular with using a broker, but Thomas has a lot of experience in selling, so it'd be great to hear about not just, Flip is an option, but there's other places too. So I'd like to dive into all of that, but can we begin, Thomas, by you explaining how you got into the world of brokering websites?
Yeah, okay, so back at university when I was 21, 22, I was looking for some ways to make some extra cash, and at the time I came across eBay, and I thought, I didn't know anything about technical things, but I always liked the idea of running my own business. So I think I bought my first website for a few dollars, got completely ripped off and screwed over, and I thought, well, not being one to give up that easily, I thought, well, I'm going to have a look around, do a bit more research. And at the time I found SitePoint, which is the old version of Flippa effectively, and found that you could buy sites on there. So I bought my first site. I can't remember exactly what it was for, $100 or around that number. I played around with it for a bit, realised that at the time there was quite a good market for flipping sites. So I was buying small sites, doing a little bit of work in it and selling it for a few hundred profit, which at the time was not a lot of money, but I mean, it was beer money. It gave me the chance to be a bit more financially free. And then from there, I did that for 6 months, a year, but it began to be quite profitable. Then I released a ebook on flipping sites, which did quite well. And from there, all the time I was still flipping my own sites. And I fell into brokerage by accident. One of the people who bought the book said, it's a great course, but I just don't have time. Would you be willing to sell the site for me? It's never something I'd even considered before, and I thought, well, yeah, I'll do that. So I did it. At the time, I just listed up on Flippa, sold the site for him. The deal went well, and I thought, well, being a student, when you're relying on cash flow, whilst flipping sites was great, the cash flow wasn't necessarily that consistent, whereas brokering meant that I could get a steady paycheck consistently selling sites. And then it kind of built up from there, just by accident and through referrals. Okay. So I fell into it off the back of the course, and then people just started approaching me.
So, okay, before we dive into the brokering, I'm curious about even just the flipping you did in the early days. Did you have a strategy that you followed by someone else? Like, did you pick certain websites of a certain subject matter or a certain format? Like, how did you work something out that allowed you to have at least beer money? I don't know what that is. Is that $500 a month or $200 a month?
Yeah. 1,000 a month or something like that.
Okay.
I mean, at the time, I didn't read any courses or anything like that. I'm not really one for buying courses. I do read a lot, but it was mainly just through trial and error. I probably spent a year until I kind of perfected it. But at the time, I was buying. It's probably not so effective now, but I was buying service sites that would sell either a product or a service, and then I was finding easy ways to sell the product. So, for example, I remember buying a traffic reseller site. I think it was $50 on SitePoint, and I realized you could go over to Digital Point forums at the time and you could resell that traffic. So what I would do is I'd go over to Digital Point, sell $200 worth of traffic in a week, and then I would sell the site for $500 or something like that. So my strategy was find any site that I could make a bit of quick money with, prove the concept, and then sell it.
So when you mean a traffic reselling website, you mean a site that someone would come to and give $50 and you would guarantee a certain amount of traffic.
Yeah, so it was the kind of site when you'd pay, I don't know, $10 and you'd get 5,000 hits.
Did that site come with the system for getting that traffic, or it would...
Yeah, it did. So that would be one of the important things, would be getting like a system in place. Because like I said, I'm not technical, so I needed a site that was up and running, which it was, and it already had the supplier in place. So all I had to do was go and find somewhere to sell, which is a concept that still works today. All you need is if you can find a site with a supplier, whether it's a service, a drop shipping site, a product, if you can buy it cheaply and you know where to sell the product or service, then you can do quite well and get quite a good return.
Can you give some other examples? I think some people might be confused with that traffic idea, but if you said, I was reselling bookkeeping services and I knew where to go get new bookkeeping clients and ramp up the income and then flip the website, that kind of makes sense. There's any other examples?
Yeah, so I mean, nowadays, like if you had an SEO service, for example, you might have been able to sell. For example, now you could buy a site that might have been reselling services from Fiverr, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, where people might sell, I don't know, 5,000 Facebook fans for $5, and you could set up a site or buy a site that sells Facebook fans for $20. So you've got a nice little markup there. So any site where you've got a product or a service with some decent margins and you can find places to sell it. So I found that webmaster sites were anything related to webmasters, internet marketers was a good place to start, just because you got an instant market. There were lots of big forums out there, lots of blogs. There were always people willing to promote products. So that seemed to be the best way to start.
Okay.
But I mean, it can apply in lots of different niches.
So can you give us two more examples from back in the day that you actually did?
So another one I did, this was a little bit different. I found a guy who was selling Facebook apps, which back in the day were quite popular. So what I did is I set up a small store selling these Facebook apps. So I bought the rights to a number of apps. I think he had 5, listed them all on my store, and then I would just sell individual licenses to the apps. So I effectively created my own app store.
So you had to get good at being both a supplier and drumming up demand for it, but you bought the sites that already had, I guess, the product or the service ready to sell.
Yeah, so I effectively found a reliable supplier who would supply it at a good level, and then found like different places to sell, whether it be forums or Flipper or wherever. So
you might have gone to SitePoint back then and you saw a Facebook app site that sold certain apps, and you also had a guy you knew who was a creator of apps and reselling rights to them. So you bought the rights off him, put them into that site you bought off SitePoint, as created a little store, and then went to a bunch of forums and say, hey, I've got these apps for sale. Do you want to go buy them? So is that roughly,
yeah,
obviously
precisely.
Right.
Yeah, it was kind of, it wasn't like a particularly good system at the time. It worked, but it wasn't particularly organised. It was more young kid hustling, trying to do whatever he could to make cash. So it was very much opportunities as they came, rather than a very strict system.
So from that, you learned, no doubt, some great skills on negotiating deals in terms of buying and selling websites. Because it sounded like you were doing it quick, right? Like you'd only have a site for 3 or 4 months. Sort of, would that be about right?
I used to do most of the time is I got a credit card, and I had to get it interest free. I had to pay it off within a month. So what I would do is I'd challenge myself at the beginning of the month to max out the credit card and then pay it off by the end, which seemed to be quite a good way to go.
Bit scary.
That was a month. Yeah, it was a little bit scary, but it gave me that incentive I needed to actually get out there and hustle. Yeah,
Okay.
so it was maybe a month, occasionally 3 months, depending on the size. I mean, nowadays, if I'm doing sites, I'll be buying in the maybe 5 6 figure range, and it might take 6 months to a year. Whereas on the lower end, you might be able to turn it around in a week or 2 weeks.
So how many sites do you think you bought and sold back then?
I was probably buying 3 or 4 a month, and then selling maybe 5 or 6. Really, it really depend. It would vary. Like one month, I might have just worked on one site. There might have been a couple of thousand. Another month, I might have bought. Someone might have been running a fire sale. They might have sold 10 sites for $300, and I might have bought them and sold them each separately for a profit. Um, so it probably would have been 50 to 100 over the course of the year, but
Okay.
all relatively small.
Right. So you really cut your teeth, so to speak, got your skills up by doing lots of little deals and learning to build lots of different types of websites by the sounds of things, which is
Yeah, it was very much just building up that skill set from nothing. So getting used to dealing with lots of different sites, lots of different people, um, lots of different technologies, lots of different products, lots of different niches, um, which is very much a transferable skill when it comes to brokering. So yeah, it was very important at the time for me to get all that wide range of deal experience, even if it was small. It's still effectively the same process.
right. It's why you're a broker now. I'd say you built up your skill base. So when it came to creating this ebook, you said you obviously felt like you had enough experience by that stage that there was stuff to go into an ebook. You had content, some sort of knowledge to share. Could you give us a highlight reel of what that ebook was about?
Yes, I mean, at the time where I was buying most of my sites, I started on SitePoint, and then I found that Digital Point has a site for sale section, and that was the best place I found for picking up bargain sites. So I used to be able to find cheap service sites, or like I said, you might find a fire sale where someone's selling 10 sites for $300 just because they couldn't be bothered or didn't have the time or the inclination to sell them separately. So you might be able to buy 10 sites for $30 and then go and sell them for 60. And while that doesn't sound like much, if it takes you 20 minutes to relist each site, you're still making $300 profit. So yeah, at the time, it was all about buying cheaply and then reselling it for a profit on Flipper, which was a bit more viable back then. I think Flipper wasn't quite as popular. Digital Point is a bit of a minefield when it comes to buying. It's not the easiest place in the world. Um, so yeah, that was the the general overview
Okay.
was buy cheap and be opportunist. So look for good deals, look for opportunities that maybe other people aren't jumping on, and then resell in a marketplace that's not necessarily used to that. So it's all about being a bit unique as well.
Yeah.
So I think I was the first person to ever sell a Facebook app on Flipper, for example.
Right.
Whereas if you just jump on the boat and copy what everyone else is doing, then it's a little bit harder to get ahead.
It does sound like you were good at finding, I guess, weaknesses in the system almost, or areas that really weren't that crowded. So you knew that Flippa or SitePoint, whatever at the time, people knew about these sorts of sites. They didn't get as much money, but if you jumped onto a marketplace that wasn't as exposed to them, what you had appeared more unique, so you could get more money for it.
Yeah, exactly. So it was effectively an arbitrage model, except you were finding, yeah, a less exposed or an opportunity that other people wouldn't see. So for example, the 10 sites for $300, other people might look at that as a lot of hassle. I would look at that as a good opportunity to um, resell it for a profit.
Right. And that's certainly a viable model today. In fact, one of the ways you might flip that around, I think, today, and I'm sure you'll talk about this when we talk about brokering, it would be find sites to buy that are not on any of the marketplaces and then take them to other places. So find sites that maybe people aren't even thinking about selling, come to them with an offer, you know how to improve the site, and then take it to a type of buyer who specializes in that sort of site or something, so they're willing to pay more money.
Yeah, absolutely. That works really well. I mean, I now experience, I guess, flipping on the slightly higher end, where people, instead of buying on a really low end marketplace and then selling on somewhere like Flipper, they might buy privately or buy on Flipper and then sell through me as a broker. So the model does work on a higher end. It's just slightly different, but I mean, the principles are still the same.
Right.
You've got to be able to spotting opportunities and closing deals is the main thing.
What's the biggest deal you've done since then? Because obviously you did $100 website back in the start, and now you're doing like,
Yeah, we've got a 2 million deal that's in the process of going through at the moment. We've done quite a few in the 700 range at the back end of last year.
okay, so
Our range really varies though. We do anything from 10,000 up to 2 million.
that must have been a growth experience, and I'd like to sort of continue your story because it's a bit of a change from going to from a hustler for small websites. You buy them for $300 and break them apart and sell them for maybe $1,000 to suddenly being in charge of a $200,000 website deal. That's a whole different kettle of fish. So take us forward. You released the ebook, then a person came to you and said, listen, I want to hire you as a broker. Now, you'd never been a broker before, so did you have to learn how to do it, or did you again just trial and error your way through it?
Yeah, I mean, so at the time, I think the biggest site I'd sold myself, I don't remember the exact number, but it was definitely under 5 figures. And this guy had a site that I believe I sold it for 18,000 in the end. So it wasn't a massive site, but it was bigger than anything I'd done before. And I was quite honest with him. I charged him a percentage. I listed it on Flipper. I walked him through the whole process. So that was like quite a small jump. I could use the same processes, and then from there I got a couple more low 5 figure deals, and then I guess my big break came back in, was it March 2011, where someone approached me with a site that I ended up selling on Flipper for 300,000. So that was the first 6 figure deal I ever did, which again I kind of fell into by accident. It was a referral. I wasn't going out there proactively seeking large deals. And once that big deal had gone through, I thought, hang on a second, this should and could be my full-time business, rather than buying and selling sites for a couple of $100 and flipping them for 1,000. It made far more sense to sell something for 300,000 and take a percentage.
Right. Like, how much does a broker normally keep?
Depending on the size, it'd be anywhere from 10 to 15%.
So if you do a $300,000 sale, you're going to make 30 grand.
Yeah, that was 30,000 in commission. I think minus the flipper fees at the time. But I mean, still, when you're relatively new to the industry, that's still quite a lot of money. Um,
Well, I think it's still quite a lot of money for a lot of people listening to this call. So,
yeah,
yeah,
that gave me the opportunity to go from like two of us working out of our bedrooms to like a formal company, having staff, having an office, which is where I am today. So I was very conscious to invest that back into infrastructure, rather than on a flashy new car or something like that. So
so
yeah,
was there a switch there? Because you sounds like you were kind of playing it by ear, and deals were just coming to you because you had connections, and one person was referring you to a next. But then you realize you've got enough money that this can be your full time business. You sounds like you have. Is it a partner you had originally there, or was that just an employee?
yeah. So I had an original business partner who I don't actually work with anymore. But I
Okay.
mean, at the time we were working together. I mean, when I did that first deal, I don't even think we had a website. So it got to the stage where when the first couple of smaller deals went through, like the 18,000, that was okay, but that wasn't quite enough to get it all down on paper, get an office, get some staff. So I did that first big deal, got it closed out, and then kind of went from there.
So you must have started being a bit more proactive and trying to get clients. Because if you're hiring people, you need to see a deal flow coming through. New websites always coming and approaching you, right?
Yeah, so what I would do is I outsource the sites we already own to my staff, and I would still buy some sites for cash flow for them to manage, and then I would go out there, um, mainly through referrals, and I used to get quite a lot of business through forums, blogs, and to be honest, it grows quite quickly if you do a good job and you're honest with people. Then it does build up quite quickly. But once we had a website in place, admittedly it wasn't a particularly good website; it was more of a placeholder. But people could at least sign up to a buyer list. They could see our listings. Flipper started interviewing me a bit on their blog, so you get some exposure.
Hmm.
And as a broker, you really don't need to do that many deals to be profitable. It's not like you have to sell 3 or 4 sites a week. You can do a couple of 5, 6 figure sites a month, and you're doing quite well.
Right. And Of course, you're here on another interview, and someone could be listening who has a website they don't want anymore, and they'll get in touch with you after listening to this call. So it is it's a growing industry, isn't it? It really is a place to be as a broker. I think it's a great market. So let's look at this now. Obviously, you're well and truly running Flipping Enterprises is the actual name of your company.
That's right.
And it's flippingenterprises.com for the website. Where I've had a look through. You've got some websites already listing for sale. You've got a form you can fill out if you want to approach you to potentially hire you as a broker to sell your own website. So can we look at some pros and cons about why someone would want to use a broker as opposed to doing it themselves?
Yeah, so I had a little think about this, and it does. I mean, hiring a broker, the first thing I'd say, and the reason that I think the business has grown through referrals and interviews is it's not like buying a product off the shelf for $50. It's very much a relationship you have with your broker. You need to trust your broker. So it really depends on the person. But then if you go into some of the reasons you might hire a broker, this won't necessarily apply to everyone, but if you've got a site, firstly, I would say that you need a site that's big enough to justify hiring a broker. And I think I mentioned earlier the smallest we do is $10,000. I know some other brokers who might not do anything below 50,000 or
Okay,
100,000.
so let me just
So
stop you there, though, Thomas. So let's say 10,000 is your minimum. How do you determine whether, like, if I have a site right now, how do I determine whether I can get 10,000 for it and potentially approach you to sell it?
yeah, so I mean, as a very rough rule of thumb, I mean, valuation is a whole different story. But I generally say if you've got a site making at least $500 a month in profit, then it's worth at least approaching me. Um, and I can only say no, or at least point you in the right direction. So I'd say, yeah, $500 a month would be
And
the
that's
low
profit,
end.
right? Not revenue.
Yeah,
That's money.
profit. Yeah,
Okay. Okay, keep going.
yeah. So from there, I mean, one of the reasons people might hire a broker is I've obviously got a lot of transaction experience, and I've got a lot of experience. I mean, like I said, I started from nothing, so I was starting with small sites that were selling for a couple of dollars, then $100, then 20,000, 300,000, a couple of million. So you've got the real range of transaction experience. And unless you're brokering or doing this for a living, most people aren't going to sell more than a couple of sites a year. So that's one thing you get straight away. You can tap into the experience across a number of niches, different verticals, different platforms. And then obviously brokers have buyers on their books. They've got buyers they've worked with before. And there's a couple of advantages that string off that. You've then got the trust factor. So this works on from the sell side and the buy side. So a buyer is generally more likely to trust a deal going through a broker, especially if you've got a good reputation, just because for me to take on a deal, I'm putting my reputation on the line, and people know that brokers aren't going to throw away their reputation over a deal. And then you've got safety as another element. I mean, you can learn about it. There are ways to protect yourself using contracts and escrow.com. But you find that if you've never done it before, there are a lot of red flags that you could read about, but I might pick up instantly. But if you've never done it before, you might not pick it up in it straight away. So there might be, I don't know, certain scams or certain things that people do to reverse engineer information that I might pick up that you might not. Another thing that is really important that people don't think about, especially on the higher end, is the emotional attachment that entrepreneurs have to their businesses. So you find that, I mean, it's difficult being a broker because I spend a lot of my time saying no to people, and I'm very much there to manage expectations. So a lot of people go try sell their business themselves, but they'll overvalue it or they won't let go. They won't negotiate on certain points, and they end up losing a deal just because they're emotionally attached. So part of my job is to get the seller to have a realistic expectation. And then I guess one of the last points on the list is time. So obviously if you use a broker, I'm going to get a prospectus prepared for every business that might be 20 pages, and that takes time. And that I've got a process in place to do that. And if you've never done one before, it might take you significantly longer. And then I've obviously got a process to get the business to market, to negotiate, to close a contract, to get escrow done. So you've got all of that. So I mean, the advantages are very much subjective. It really depends what you're doing. I mean, I've got clients who have sold plenty of sites themselves, and they might say, "Hey Thomas, look, I've got this site. It's worth about 20,000, but I just don't have time. Can you sell it for me?" So that works. On the reason why you wouldn't hire a broker, if you think you're going to sell sites regularly, then one of the things about hiring a broker is you obviously won't learn the process yourself. You'll get an indication, but if you hired me, you wouldn't see everything I'm doing. So you'd miss out on a little bit of experience in there. And it's obviously a good skill to have if you know how to sell your own business. Then you can repeat that over and over.
A lot of people would be sort of thinking there's two sides. So you have to pay a broker 10 to 15% of your margin to hire someone to do it, which you're paying for a service. I think the prospectus and the connections and negotiation skills and all that is highly valued. And the assumption here is that you then have two specific outcomes. You can get a higher price than I could, and you can much more likely close a deal because you can go to more places, more buyers, and have a better buying package. So it's just more likely that you'll make the sale than I will. That's really the reasons to use a broker, right?
That's another way I pitch it. Similar to hiring a good accountant, you're going to save more money than you're going to spend on the accountant. And the same with hiring a good broker. You would expect to get them to get, I mean, especially 10, 15% in terms of a sale. It's not that big. So you might have a site that you could sell for 200,000, which is obviously a lot of money, but I might sell it for you for 250,000. And then if you pay me 10%, you're still 25,000 up on where you would have been. So yeah, the main thing there is the value of it, I guess.
Okay, now I don't want you to give away all your secrets, Thomas, but I will encourage you to do so. What do you do to help a site sell for more than the average person could get? Is there some way of packaging the site, or a certain type of buyer you go for, or are you just a better negotiator? How does it get a higher price?
But, I mean, a lot of it is down to reputation. Like I said, people like using a broker for the safety side and the trust side. And if a buyer and a seller trusts the process more, then they're more likely to pay more. The second thing is, like I said, just like time and having a good process in place. So if you buy a site through us or sell a site for us, we prepare a prospectus that averages about 20 pages long about the business. And I think from a buyer perspective, if you've got a 20-page prospectus, it's a lot better than a scammy looking sales copy that someone's written on Flipper and a couple of screenshots. So having that formal process in place and having a reputation, but obviously for the average person, that's not necessarily something you can replicate. But I think the main thing is just being honest, trustworthy, having a good reputation and like kind of sticking to your word. Being transparent is very important. Negotiating is important, but I mean, something I say to clients all the time, and this is something that a lot of people don't think about, is that brokering when selling a business isn't necessarily about getting the highest price. It's about getting the best deal. So you might find, let's say you had a site that was, let's value it at $50,000, and you might have one buyer who's offered 50,000 and one who's offered 45,000, and the buyer who's offered 50,000 has never bought a business before. They don't have it all in cash, so they want to finance an element of it. And then the $45,000 buyer has done a lot of deals before. They know the industry. They're basically going to take the site off you, and you're never going to hear from them again. So in that respect, it can also be quite subjective. So that's where I would advise clients on where to take the best deal. So it's not necessarily about negotiating the highest price. It's about negotiating a deal that works.
I mean, I've sold a few sites, and one particular sale comes to mind that I had a buyer that just sucked a lot of my time post-purchase. I'm thinking even with using a broker, you just got your crossing your T's and dotting your I's done really well. So everything is tight. The contracts are better. you got systems and documentation in place and a person to communicate with who's like a negotiator. So it's that like it sounds to me the way you answer that question. There are no ninja techniques for getting a higher price or doing a better deal. It's just being more professional about the whole process, because that's what you guys do month after month. Where I might be selling one site my entire life, or maybe once every 2 or 3 years or something like that. So it just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, there's definitely no like special secrets. It's not an easy process. It's probably not quite as easy as it sounds. Like you got to have the experience. But I mean, a lot of it is just about being honest with people, being transparent, and just working out a deal that works for both parties. I think a lot of people, when I'm going back to the not having the emotional attachment, one of the reasons it's good to have a broker is you've got a relatively impartial third party who wants to get a deal that's going to work for both sides. So, for my side, I'd like to see buyers who get a good deal and then come back, and I like to get sellers who get a good deal and then come back. So it's important for me for both sides to win, and then that works best around. Like you said, the worst thing you want, especially if you're a busy entrepreneur or you're selling because you're retiring or whatever, the last thing you want is a buyer who's going to be calling you at 2 in the morning for the next 6 months. So it's very important to get a deal done honestly. And if you do it honestly and properly, and you haven't lied about anything, you haven't oversold it, then you're just not going to have any hassle after the sale, and
Okay.
it makes life a lot easier.
I've got two subjects I'd like to cover still with you, and if we can get a little bit more practical in the details. Now, you mentioned earlier valuations, a bit of a subjective tool. Could you tell me what you look at in terms of the variables, and even using an example? I know you can't mention names, but if you know the size of a site and the traffic it had and how much money it was making, and even if you can say what industry it was in and how you came to determine a value, just something to make this really tangible, because it's the biggest question I think for everyone is how much is my website worth?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the most common question I get asked, and just looking at industry blogs, forums in general, it's probably one of the most common questions out there. I mean, every broker has a different way of doing it, and I don't think there's a right way of doing it. I mean, the old cliche is a business is only worth what someone's willing to pay. So off that, if you kind of extrapolate that cliche, a lot of the way I value businesses now is based on the deals I've done. So I've obviously got a lot of data on multiples that sites sell for, and different variables. And then over time, I've kind of built up, whether it be in my head or in a kind of document, different variables that either increase or decrease a multiple. So I was discussing this with someone the other day actually, and I said to them what I do. This is assuming the site's established. The valuation model, as you go for sites below 20,000, probably doesn't work quite as well, just because you tend to get sites that go for, they might make $30 a month and they'll sell for a multiple of 5 years. But I mean, that's not, I ignore sub 20K for the purpose of valuation.
Okay.
So what I do is I start at a multiple of 2 years net income, or 24 months, whichever way you want to look at it. Um, so when I say net income, I'm talking after costs, not necessarily after paying yourself, but after you've bought, if you've got stock, you bought stock, after paying your server costs, after paying your AdWords, after paying your virtual assistant, after paying your SEO. So I take a base of 2 times net income, and that would be a very broad average for the industry. And then some variables that might increase that. So a site that is very hands off and has a lot of history. And when I say a lot of history, I'm talking about 3 years of stable, preferably growing trading history. A business that is hands off. People in the industry like to talk about passive businesses, which don't really exist. It's kind of a bit of a myth. But so recently, I did a deal that sold for 700,000, and that site was making 350,000 a year. So it sold for almost exactly 2 times net income. And one of the good things about that business is the owner didn't really do any work on it. He had a full-time member of staff who basically did everything. She ran it. All he did was pay the AdWords costs, check the sales. So it was very much hands off. So that was a business that could go around the 2 times multiple, and that's going back to the whole which deal do you accept. So this guy ended up taking a cash offer at 700,000 from a very experienced buyer. And while I would look at that business because it's quite hands off, had some history, then it might go above 2 times. It was established that that was a better offer. The guy wanted to move on. Um, and then things that lower the multiple, there's a lot in here. So,
Just to stop you
yeah,
before you go with that list, Thomas, I am curious because that example, 350 net, so that's 350 after taking out expenses or before taking out expenses, just to be clear.
yeah, after expenses.
Okay, so it's 350 grand in the bank at the end of a year, or total for a year, and he's taken an offer at 2 times that, so he could make that money just running the business, letting it run for 2 years, theoretically, anyway, assuming things continued as they were. It sounds like almost like that's an undervaluation, because if you look at some of these, .com startups and things like that, if it's a business making 350,000 a year in profit, it's like getting a 10 times multiple often, when people are raising venture capital or something like that. So that would go for like $3 million as opposed to 700,000. Of course, that's for investing, not necessarily buying it, but it seems like a big difference there.
Yeah, I'd say one of the things there. I mean, if you look at the kind of things a VC would invest in, they would invest in a business that has potentially explosive growth and has the ability to scale massively. This particular business had quite a few years of trading at that level, so it was relatively likely that in the next year it would do the same number again. There wasn't really, I mean, there was room for growth, but that was very much an unknown variable. And another thing was this guy, it's where it becomes very subjective. So a good deal for one person isn't necessarily a good deal for someone else. This guy had another business elsewhere and he was looking to raise cash for it. In the current economy, you obviously can't walk into your bank and borrow $700,000. So a cash offer of 700,000 allowed him to invest elsewhere. And if you've got his other business might have been making 4 times as much profit and growing, could have been tripling in size every year. So in that situation, it becomes a good deal. But if you've got a large portfolio of passive businesses, then it might not be the best deal in the world. So you can't always look at a deal in terms of the
Straight numbers.
absolute it's sold for. You've really got to look at it in context.
Yeah, I can see that, because it sounds to me like you got the buyer a great deal because he can just let it sit there and have that employee run it, assuming nothing breaks down and they don't quit on him or anything like that, and he can make his money back in 2 years and be making 300 grand a year after that. So that's a pretty good turnaround. And for the seller, like you said, it's a situational kind of condition. He wanted to get cash. He got cash in hand for another business right then and there. So it didn't have to wait, didn't have to negotiate. So it's just situational. Anyway.
Yes, one of those win-win deals.
Yeah. Okay, so you were saying there was lots of things that can be detrimental, that reduces the value of a site, and you were going to list some things out.
Yeah, so this is where, especially as you get smaller businesses, I would say for businesses that have less history, so anything with less than a year of history is highly unlikely to sell for a 2 times multiple. So anything below the more you drop below 2 years, the lower the multiple goes. There isn't really a mathematical formula, but you might say that if the site's a year old, it might only go for a year of income. So one of the other things that would negatively affect valuation is traffic sources. In the last year, Google have obviously done a lot of shake-ups, a lot of updates. So you see a lot of sites that were previously doing really well got hit by updates. So if you've got a site that relies entirely on Google traffic, especially if it's one particular keyword, then buyers would perceive that as quite high risk. So the multiple would reduce. Another thing is legal and trademark issues. You quite often get domains that have trademark issues, and while most of the time trademark holders might ignore it or you can get away with it, or that's still something that increases the risk. So multiples of that might be significantly lower than 2 times. businesses with a revenue source that's seasonal, that's something that definitely reduces multiples. So we're looking at an e-commerce business at the moment that does literally 80% of its sales in December. And while that could be quite consistent, it's obviously very difficult for someone to spend a 2 times yearly multiple, knowing they have to wait to December to make back most of their income. So so a site that's inconsistent, a site that's dropping in income, that's definitely something that you're going to lose your multiple a bit there. So if you did, I don't know, 100,000 in 2011, and then you did 50,000 in 2012, and then January 2013 is looking slow, then multiple wise, that's really where you start getting rock bottom. So yeah, traffic sources is one, revenue source. So if you've got a single product that might not necessarily have a very long life cycle. So for example, if you look in the internet marketing niche, you might have a product and the life cycle on that might be literally a month. It might do really well, do 100,000 in gross sales from JVs and affiliates, and then it will die down to almost nothing. But then you might have a site similar to the hobby train site that you mentioned earlier that Ian owned. That was a business where it had a recurring product. It's an evergreen niche. The content never changes. So that's something that bumps the multiple. I think Ian got 2.5 times yearly for that.
What's the biggest multiple you've got?
For a site that's got enough size to be relevant, about 3.5. And that was a forum. Forums tend to be popular and go for pretty high multiples. Products that are recurring do really well. So anything where you've got people pay month after month, assuming the churn rate, so the rate that people drop out, isn't too high, so they can go nearer the higher end. Yeah, so the product is very important. So if it's an evergreen product like a hobby niche or so something like gardening or garden sheds, so really boring niches tend to go for solid multiples. And then the more erratic niches like internet marketing, forex is another infamous one. You're looking at a far lower multiple. So I mean, there are really lots and lots of variables that go in there, but I always start from a base of 2 times and then add or subtract based on the variables that are in place. So you might have a business it might be really passive, so I might bump it up to 2.5 times in my head, but then it might have an issue that's quite seasonal, so I might bump it back down to 2. Or you could have a business that's really seasonal, so I might knock it down to 1.5, and then it might have some potential trademark issues, so it might go down to 1. So again, I'm not particularly scientific with my valuations. A lot of it's just done on experience and past transactions. But I like to start with a base number that I would quote as a general valuation, and then go from there.
Okay, that's a pretty good wrap up on valuation. So if we are looking to sell a site, and let's not even talk about necessarily using a broker, but obviously these are brokering techniques. How do you advise people nowadays to sell a site, both with and without a broker? Like, which sites do you recommend they go to? And I'd love to dig into your prospectus a little bit too, and like what things you put in there. Like, is just to clarify the question, would the order be, okay, I've decided to sell my site. I need to collect my data. I need to fill out a prospectus, assuming we're not using a broker, and then go and post a bunch of notices on a bunch of websites and see if that works?
So the first thing you need to do, like rightly point out, is start getting your documentation together. And this is something that if anyone listening is planning to sell their business in the next 6 or 12 months, don't think about it last minute. It's a mistake that a lot of people make. They say, oh, I was never thinking about selling, so I never bothered tracking the income. If you've got a portfolio of sites, make sure you track the income and make sure it's very transparent. Same goes for traffic. Most people use Google Analytics. There's a lot of conspiracy theories out there, but I still think it's the best product out there for traffic tracking. So assuming you've got all that,
well, what's
you want to get all your
what do you have? What you want? Google Analytics for traffic.
So you want your traffic verification and your income verification. So if you've got a ClickBank product, you want to go into your ClickBank account. If you've got a product that sells via a merchant account, you want your merchant account statements. If you've got a product that sells by PayPal, you've got PayPal. If you've got a site that earns through AdSense, then you've got your AdSense income broken down by channels. Okay. So you want to get all your verification together. And I always say to people, it's a lot better to get more than you need. So there's no such thing as too much detail when it comes to verification. So put as much as you can together. Valuation, again, that's a difficult thing. So if you're going through a broker, obviously the broker will do the valuation for you. If you are selling it yourself, this is where it becomes quite difficult. So you could use my valuation starting at 2 times. I mean, 2 times is generally a good rule of thumb. But one thing you can do is if you go onto Flipper, which is the biggest public marketplace out there for selling sites, and if you look at sites that have sold, I think they've got a tab called just sold or recently ended last time I checked. If you go in there, you can then filter. So you would then filter listings and find a listing that's as close as possible to your site in niche, size, income. So if you've got, for example, you might have a e-commerce store that sells footballs. So you would go onto Flipper and you would search football sites, and if you can't find a site that sells footballs, find something close, so sporting goods. You can then narrow it down by that, and then you want to narrow it down by e-commerce. And then once you've got a few deals with a bit of data, you can then look at the multiples they've been selling for. So you might find that there were 2 sites that sold in that niche. One sold for 2 times and one sold for 2.5 times income. So you might then find that you can list it for 2.5. But I mean, this is one thing that a lot of people advise, and I think this is not very good advice, that if you're thinking about selling your business, that you can just list it at any price and see what people offer. But you find that serious buyers will always be alienated if you just have really unrealistic pricing expectations. So it's not a good idea just to list something for 10 times net income and hoping you get lucky, because you're just going to alienate the people who really do know what they're doing. And the people who actually will be interested are usually just time wasters, or tire kickers, or whatever you want to call them. So get your documentation together, get a number that you think it can sell for based on what you've seen, and also what you're comfortable with. And if what you're comfortable with and what is realistic is quite a long way apart, then you really need to reconsider. And that kind of goes back to part of my job as a broker, is a lot of my time is spent saying no to people. A lot of people say, look, I want this amount, and I'll say, well, it's worth that. And the difference will just be too much. It's just a no-go. So get some realistic expectations. Prepare a prospectus, which we can go into a little bit more detail later. So an overview of the business, traffic, income, what you do to run it, what you do to grow it, what it requires to maintain it, what you're including in the sales, really important. So once you've done that, I would advise for most sites, if it's worth less than $100,000, and assuming you don't want to go with a broker, then Flipper's probably your best bet. Flipper have got a new listing process actually that's quite intuitive. You can go through the process. They've got a guide on there that I actually helped them wrote, and I think it walks you through the Flipper process and how to prepare an auction properly. It's a free download, so have a look at that. It kind of gives you best practices. So it's important to be transparent, but not too transparent. The last thing you want to do is give all of your information away publicly. I like to qualify buyers before I give too much away. So you might want to give them an overview of the income, but you don't necessarily want to email everyone in the world your bank statements. So it's important to be transparent. Preparing the listing. Flipper, you get a lot of people who just write really strong sales copy. And when I first started out, a lot of it would be, how much can you hype up the $200 site? But when you're selling on the higher end, I've always found that sales copy becomes slightly less effective. So if you're selling a $100,000 business, it's highly unlikely that with some good sales copy, you're going to sell it to an investor when they didn't really want to buy it in the first place. Just write out a listing, be very clear. So an overview of the business, what you do to run it, what you do to grow it, what you're including in the sale, your income, and where the income comes from as well is important. And if you've got a product, explain the suppliers. Obviously, don't tell them the supplier, but say you might have a contract with a supplier and how that works. Same for traffic. The traffic's something that a lot of people are misleading with. So it's not necessarily that they lie about how much traffic they're getting, because obviously with Google Analytics you can verify that, you can go into the account, but people underestimate how much time they spend. So some people might spend 20 hours a week doing SEO out there link building, but just won't mention it. So it's very important that you're honest. And to be honest, if you're not, you might get away with it, but in the long run, it's going to catch up with you. And most people, especially experienced buyers, they're going to see right through it. If they can see that you're building lots of links on a daily basis, then it's going to be quite obvious that you're not spending 20 minutes a week like they claim. And that's another thing. How much time do you spend running the business? That, I would say, is probably the most lied about question. Even from a broker, if I ask someone, people always lie about it. My rule of thumb in-house, again, it's not particularly scientific, but whatever amount someone says they take running a business, double that and assume that's more accurate. So if they say 5 hours a week, assume 10 hours a week. And if you are going to list how much time you spend on the business, if you break down the tasks, it's a little bit more believable. So if you say I spend 5 hours a week, you might say I spend 2 hours responding to clients, I spend an hour looking for new clients, and then I spend 2 hours doing the books. And then from there, if you're using Flipper, just go through the process. I always set a buy it now number, which is the valuation you've come up with. And if at this stage you want to make it a little bit higher, so if you think it's worth 2 times net income from the research you've done, maybe put it on for 2.5 times. And while you don't necessarily expect to get that higher number, I always like to list it a little bit higher, just so I got a little bit of room to negotiate. The worst thing you want to do is be listing it for 40,000 with 40,000 being the lowest you want to take, because then you've just got no room to negotiate. Set a reasonable reserve. And the other thing that a lot of people forget about, and a lot of people buy courses on selling sites and then they wonder why they haven't sold, is communication is so important. You need to answer questions promptly, honestly. If people want to talk on the phone, get on the phone. If you're not so confident on the phone, then maybe speak to them on Skype or an instant messaging program or whatever. But communicate, answer questions honestly, which is very important. A lot of people completely forget about that. Someone might post a comment and they might respond 4 days later, and that doesn't look good. And while you might be a really busy person, obviously lots of people are busy, it's really important you at least show that you're interested in making the sale. So I mean that would be a general overview of how I would sell. Obviously there's a lot more to it than that, but
Right.
that'd be a solid overview.
Then thank you for that. That was wonderfully detailed. One thing you didn't mention though is outside of Flipper, where else can we go to sell websites?
Ooh, I mean, there are other marketplaces out there. I would say, to be honest, if you've got a site, like I said, under 100,000, then Flipper's your best bet. I don't even bother listing elsewhere just because there's not as much exposure. People complain about Flipper. I mean, Flipper does have its shortcomings. It is quite expensive. I mean, you pay for premium listings $250, and then you pay a 5% success fee up to $2,000. So it can be quite expensive, and that's why people are always tempted to search out. They're like, oh, you can list on Warrior Forum or Digital Point, which is true, and it might be cheaper, but your exposure to buyers is a lot lower. And similar to you were saying earlier about hiring a broker, you'd expect to make more by hiring a broker. it's the same with if you skimp and go list your site on, say, Digital Point, for example, which is a good example of a site with lots of traffic and lots of buyers, but the prices really are rock bottom. You might think, oh, I've just saved $250 or $29, depending what option you choose on Flipper, listing on Digital Point. But your $10,000 site might sell for 5,000. So while you might have spent less up front, you've actually ended up losing quite a lot of money on the back end. Um, so yeah, Flipper really is the most viable option. Depending on the size of your business, there's also some business marketplaces which are probably more widely used by brokers, and it's really more suitable for businesses that are in the 6, 7, even 8 figure range, and that would be so sites like Biz Buy Sell, that's BIZ, buysell.com, BizQuest, BIZ Quest. They're good options for slightly larger sites. But beyond that, I mean, there's lots of Flipper clones, Flipper competitors, wannabe competitors. And while I personally would love to see some competition in the industry, being perfectly honest and realistic, Flipper really is the best place to sell. It is quite expensive, but if you're not willing to invest up front, then you can't really have high hopes for yourself.
It's a bit like eBay. eBay's cornered the market, and Flippa's sort of cornered the market for website flipping. One question I do have though, would it make sense, or is this a stupid idea, to yes list on Flippa, but why not copy and paste the listing on every other site you can find to increase your exposure, assuming it doesn't cost too much?
That used to be one of my old tricks. Is I used to do that, and then you would list it in lots of different places. But I think I'm not 1,000% sure, but I think Flipper require exclusivity. So if you list on Flipper, you're not allowed to list it elsewhere. So what you can do though is if you are looking on a forum and someone says, "Oh, I want to buy," let's say you're selling my made up example of a site that sells footballs, and someone says, "Oh, I want to buy a site related to sports. Here's my budget." Then you can always just send them a message and say, "Oh, here's a listing on Flipper you might like." So while you're not supposed to just copy and paste the listing elsewhere. And I know forums like Digital Point don't allow you to link elsewhere. You can. There's no reason why you can't direct people to your Flipper listing. Um,
Inappropriate places, really. You can't just go and create a new thread and say, hey, check out my Flippa listing.
Yeah, I mean, the worst thing you want to do, I mean, selling a business or a website, whatever you want to call it, is all about trust. So the last thing you want to do is be seen spamming your listing everywhere. And while you might be getting more exposure and more traffic to that listing, it's not necessarily. There's one thing getting traffic to a listing, and there's another thing getting qualified buyers to a listing. So you could have someone could list a site and have 1,000 different buyers looking at it, or I could list a site and maybe have 100 buyers, but those 100 buyers might all be regular investors who know what they're doing, and those 1,000 people might be people who've read an ebook on site flipping and they've got $50 in the bank, so they might look at the site, but they're never actually going to buy it. Um, yeah, while it's good to get extra exposure, you want to get the right exposure.
Oh, look, let's say I've got a website worth about 50 grand. So it's above your 20 grand target, but below your sort of 100,000 qualification to list on Flippa. So you're recommending to use Flippa for that sort of site. My site's worth 50. Should I go to a broker, or should I just, go fill out the process in Flippa?
Yeah, one thing I would say, especially when it comes to a broker, is unlike Flipper, there's no upfront cost. So although with brokers they would ask for exclusivity, but it's at least worth chatting to a few brokers and seeing what they say. You might find, so for example, with my business, we've got quite a few buyers on the books who buy regularly, and I know exactly what they're looking for. So you might come to me with a certain site, and I'll be, so for example, I had a seller who came to me the other day with a coupon blog. It was like free coupons for like products, and I know I've got a buyer who regularly buys coupon sites, and I said to him, "Oh yeah, I can sell this. I've got a regular buyer," and I called up my buyer, and the sale completed in a couple of days. So brokers, I mean, obviously you've got to be able to look through the bullshit or whatever you want to call it. Some brokers are obviously to get you on the books are going to overvalue your business. And that's where I would really, if someone values your business above a multiple of, say, 2.5 times net, then I would ask them for some proof or verification of deals that they've done at that level. So with a broker, there's two types of brokers out there. There's one that will take on lots and lots of listings by overvaluing, getting you to sign a contract, and then they'll have 100 sites listed. And then there are brokers who do far fewer listings, but they're a lot more realistic with their valuations. But you can speak to a broker for your 50,000 site, and the worst that's going to happen is you're going to speak to me, and I'm going to say, sorry, I'm not interested, or sorry, I only think it's worth 30,000. Or, oh, I think this might take a bit of time to sell. And then you're well within your rights to go elsewhere. But I mean, one thing to note with a broker, if you do work with a broker, any decent broker will ask for exclusivity. And exclusivity, all that means is that so let's say you decided to sell a site through me, you'd sign up and we would agree a fee. And exclusivity period is the length of time that I can market the business for and get paid if it sells. So obviously, from a broker's perspective, we don't get paid anything up front, so we only get paid if the business sells. So the last thing I want to do is spend a week preparing a prospectus for a business, sending it out to my buyers, and then one of my clients listing the site on Flipper, saying, "Oh, I've got an offer. Thanks, Thomas, but I've just sold it." So that's why brokers have exclusivity. So there is a bit of commitment there. But I mean, with a broker, there is nothing to lose cost-wise. You obviously only pay them if it sells. They can't force you to sell. And I would say with a broker, it's worth definitely at least speaking to one, because they're going to give you an honest valuation of what it's worth. I mean, the nature of the industry, because I only get paid if I sell a business, there's no incentive for me lying about what it's worth.
What if you take on a client and then list it on Flipper, but it doesn't sell? Do you absorb the Flipper fee, or does the client should they expect to have some sort of costs?
We don't use Flipper very often. I can't give you an exact percentage of deals that go on there, but maybe 10% of deals. But if we do use Flipper, we pay for it ourselves. So if it doesn't sell, then I would pay for that myself.
Okay.
I would personally, if you're looking at maybe a slightly smaller broker who's starting out, they'll probably ask you for costs, but I would always say no to that. I would never. At the end of the day, if you're approaching a broker, you're not paying someone to list it on Flipper. I might use Flipper as one of my sales places, but I mean that's my marketing cost. You're paying me to sell your business, so you're not paying me to list your business. Yeah, brokers would. And that's the other reason you ask for exclusivity as a broker. It's that there's upfront costs in listing a business, marketing it, contacting people, etc.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thomas, I think it's a great time for us to say how to get in touch with you if they do want to ask you for an opinion on their site and getting, starting a conversation with you about potentially using you as a broker. So where should they go?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you mentioned earlier, our main website is flippingenterprises.com. If you go there, you can see we've got a buyer list that you can sign up to. So if you're interested to have a look, we have a listings page, which has our current listings and a lot of sold listings on there. And I would say with that, get on the list, because we sell a lot of sites that never even get listed, because we have, like I said, we have buyers who buy regularly. So quite often I'll be able to match a buyer and seller before it even gets listed. And then we've got a form on there which you can fill out, which is quite detailed. So details about the site, and it's completely no obligation. You fill it out. Either me or one of my team, so probably be Ismail or Ryan, will get back to you with a few questions and then give you a valuation. If you want to email me directly, my email is thomas@flippingenterprises.com. But I mean, yeah, if you go on the site, there's a section for buyers. There's a section of our listings. There's a form you can fill out for if you want to sell a business. There's also a support email on there. So if you don't remember my email, thomas@flippingenterprises.com, then you can fill out a general question. I'm busy, but I'm usually quite happy to answer questions. And if you said, you listen to this podcast, then I'm more than happy to answer questions. We try as much as possible in that respect.
Okay, awesome. It's been a bit of an epic interview. We've already gone over an hour, so I think it's a good time to wrap it up, Thomas. Thank you for being as detailed as you have been. It's obviously a subject we could talk about for probably 3 or 4 hours, because there's information in the prospectus, there's information on valuation, there's information on doing the negotiation, the transfer. We didn't even touch about actually transferring a website from one person to the other and how that happens, or transferring the money from one person to the other and how that happens. So there's lots of layers to this, which sites to sell on. Go to your go to you, I think, to get some answers to those questions. If you have a site, like, we should probably preface this and say you don't want people who've got a website that's making $100 a month coming to you for brokerage advice. It's just not really worth your time. So 10,000 was your sort of your lower limit, and to figure out whether your site's worth that, roughly $500 a month in profit is needed to value a site at $10,000, correct?
Yeah, right.
Okay. Thomas, thank you for taking the time to do this. Got a great business going there, a great service, and I can tell you really know what you're talking about. So I appreciate you sharing your knowledge with everyone listening in today. Thank you.
So much. I appreciate your time, and hopefully some people will find that helpful.
I'm sure they will. So, and good luck, Thomas, with everything you're doing in the future.
Thank you very much. You too. Have a good one.
And thank you for listening in to the Entrepreneur's Journey podcast. You know where to go to find all the other episodes. Just head to my blog, entrepreneurs-journey.com, or Google my name, which is Yaro, Y-A-R-O. And I'll catch you on another interview very soon. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.